Hey, I'm going to today do my reaction to Hitler Oversimplified Part 2 to follow up on what I did recently. So I hope you enjoy it.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant. After the war,
I like the
communists in
James
Germany had
Bond.
attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general. So Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags, so Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs, so he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans.
Yeah, they weren't specific on policy. Like you said, they did have, I think it was 21 points that remained important for the Nazi Party throughout the years leading up to their takeover of power. Especially as Hitler starts running for president and they start to get into these elaborate election campaigns about 10 years later, from the time he's pointing out now. The Nazis become known for kind of becoming all things to all people, sort of. They become socialists for the left. They kind of become pro industry and not pro capitalism, but pro industry for those on the right. Big business has to have its fears assured about the Nazi Party, and so they kind of do this to try to mend and bend and be flexible to win campaigns. Now, I think you see some on the right today try to argue that they were actually, they emphasize the socialism and the National Socialists, and they try to emphasize that they were left leaning. And I think that's kind of goes against what historians have decided, which is that, you got communism on the far left and you got fascism on the far right. And I think those arguments sort of neglect all of the nationalism and the emphasis on hierarchy and things like this that really do make the Nazis far right. I'm not trying to dismiss some of what their critiques are, things like state control of the economy and gun control and some of those things, gun control against the Jews. Some of those things, you will find, at least in the American context, being right-leaning or conservative, being more libertarian on some of those things. I understand the criticism there, but I think for the sake of simplicity, for the sake of understanding for everyone, it's best to retain the sort of understanding that Nazis are far right and communists are far left. I think that I think both sides demonize each other too much by claiming, anyone who's liberal at all, they're a communist. Anyone who's conservative at all, they're a Nazi. I think that's wrong, and we shouldn't do that. But I think we need to get the facts straight about the history. And in this sense, it's hard to say that, the Nazis were left leaning in that way.
Into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive Whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment.
Yeah, it's the Sturmabteilung, the SA for short, and they become very important kind of as he said, the paramilitary. They're kind of the muscle of the Nazi Party. They're there to protect Nazi speakers from any sort of threatened violence. They cause a lot of violence themselves, the SA.
Or SA for short. Their job was to defend Nazi Party meetings and intimidate political opponents, and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time.
Yeah, this is a point I made last time, which is that, actually the Allies after World War I didn't do enough. The Versailles Treaty, is often criticized as doing too much against Germany, creating a martyrdom, creating a persecution complex for Germans. But I think the case can easily be made, and that they should have done more in the sense of having more of a presence in Germany to stop things like the SA from growing. Because, like he said, you had these decommissioned military, these soldiers who had fought years in World War I, who now all of a sudden are out of a job, and they end up doing things like this, joining paramilitary groups and doing the things they're good at, except doing it for an extreme ideology. And if we had Allies had more of a presence, it's possible that some of this could have been stopped.
The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919...
Yeah, this is obviously a big concern around the world today in terms of printing money for stimulus packages. There's great concern about the inflation of here in America, the inflation of the dollar. And it's a concern. And you'll see it's not, the idea of printing money is not a no cost solution. It can, the argument goes, it can stimulate the economy and get people to start spending money again, to put money back in the people start buying goods and services again. The issue is that there's real consequences to inflation. People's hard-earned money becomes less valuable, and it can cause a whole society to collapse if people can't if their money isn't actually worth anything.
$1 US was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, $1 US was equal to 4.2 trillion marks. The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 19...
That's the other thing about anything that causes a lot of social crisis, an upending of the normal order, a thing like inflation, is it can possibly lead to extreme and violent ideologies taking over a culture because of the extreme conditions. And that's what happened in Germany.
23. Inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters,
the beer hall
he marched on the
putsch.
streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not. Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months.
Served a little bit,
It was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book. The whole affair was covered by the media nationwide, and it made...
Yeah, the other part of it is he had his fans and people who really started to come to get to know who he was because of his leadership in the beer hall putsch, and because of the publicity of the trial. He started to really develop fans all across the country, and they would send him flowers and pastries and things like this to his time in prison at Landsberg prison. And it really wasn't a prison. It felt more like, he said, like sometimes it felt more like a nice retreat for him. And, he wrote his book, like he said. He gave speeches to anyone who would listen. He really developed his ideas. And like I said in another reaction video. This was another chance for him to be stopped if the judge had actually given him a harsher sentence and forced him to carry it out. For attempting a coup on the country, which it seems like if that happened today, there should have been a harsher sentence for it, which obviously there should have been. And that could have stopped the Nazis, as if there would have been a harsher coup. That's what a historian, a scholar who I interviewed for my podcast mentioned. And I think he's right.
Made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany, but the everyday German still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence.
Just a few years later, though,
politician like he was, but a new economic crisis would change all of that.
Great Depression.
To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after
election. Why are we yelling?
The Nazis
I feel that way a lot.
Until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German.
Yeah, those are the key years for the rise of the Nazi Party. This late 20s, early 30s, this sort of rapid increase. And, in 1932, Hitler runs for president. I'm not sure if he's going to go over this. By the end of that year, there's actually Hindenburg, who won the presidency over Hitler and had been president for a while. He supposedly, according to parliamentary order, you should put the leader of the most popular party in parliament as your chancellor. And as you can see right here, the Nazis by 1932 became the biggest party in parliament. But throughout the year, Hindenburg refused to make Hitler chancellor because of his sort of his extreme nature and some of the crazy things he would say, and also some of Hindenburg's sort of view of Hitler as he was nothing more than a corporal in World War I, whereas Hindenburg had been this great general of the German military. And Hindenburg looked down on Hitler because he was, this corporal who had been homeless in Vienna at one point in his life. Yet by January of 1933, just a month later from December of 1932, when it seemed like all was lost for the Nazis, Hindenburg changed his mind and decided to make Hitler chancellor. There's a whole number of reasons for how this happened. I did a podcast about it, so check it out if you get the chance. And everything changed within that 1 month. And next thing you know, the Nazis are in power. It's fascinating bit of history, something that almost didn't happen. Of course, the whole world was changed pretty much in this 1 month in Germany.
In Parliament, Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party, though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist.
Yeah.
Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism. And leader of the Center Party, von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power. We'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet." What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything.
Yeah.
Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents. Communists and others were sent off to the first concentration camp
Yep.
in Dachau. At
Dachau,
this
there it
time,
is.
the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. He introduced a law to parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator. He still
Führer.
had one problem. The
He
leader
called
of
it-
the SA
he
wanted
called
the
himself
SA
the
to take over the
Führer.
job of the regular German army.
Here's
And
the
German
Night of the
army
Long
didn't like
Knives
that idea.
in the
Hitler
summer
needed to maintain
of
the support from
34.
his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA. So one night in June 1934, he had Röhm and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was
Yep.
at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in the past, reporters who had printed negative
Yeah, Schleicher was someone who was an important part of the Nazi Party, and he had disagreed with Hitler in that time period I was talking about earlier, late 1932, early 1933, and had made Hitler really mad. And Schleicher, left the party. And of course, here, Hitler gets his revenge on Schleicher.
articles about him. One guy who did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some cases, even their families were murdered. In total, up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army, now satisfied that they wouldn't be replaced, pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute.
Yeah, and he means that literally. They took an oath to Hitler himself. Hitler was fascinated with rituals and these kinds of things. He often did rituals using they called it a blood flag, and it was a Nazi flag that had been part of the beer hall putsch that had blood from those who had been, killed in the putsch from the early 20s, and really strange stuff, to be honest. But, what do you expect from the Nazis?
Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted. And eventually, Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it. This way, it seemed like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose him,
it's just crazy how fast it happened. It's just over the course of a few years, all of a sudden, boom, you're in a totalitarian dystopia where you have to greet using Hail Hitler or else you're going to be thrown in a concentration camp. It's just nuts. One of the things I've always said when I got interested in reading about this time period is just you can feel the weight of it as you're reading about it. And you can really feel the weight of this time period with the craziness. And it's hard to think this actually happened and that people actually lived through this, especially if you're a minority then. So anyways, it always gets to me when I watch a video or read more about it.
Hitler, or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp. German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon, his aggressive foreign policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as
World War II is the deadliest conflict in human history. So not only did Hitler bring chaos and death to his own country, he brought it to the whole world in World War II. So it's pretty sad when you think back on it. And it's hard to, every time, like I said, every time you revisit these events, it's hard to stomach. And anyways, I've done a reaction to Oversimplified World War II Part 1. I'm going to do Part 2. And I hope you enjoyed this. Again, please check out my podcast if you get the chance. And thank you for watching.